Recording. Okay, so unfortunately, Landon couldn't be here with us today. He had some personal things going on, but he sends his apologies. And also, we apologize for what happened last time. Sorry about that, that it cut off. So anyway, we wanted to bring Andrew back today to continue the conversation around homelessness in Salt Lake City and what the mayor's office is doing and all of that good stuff. So I pulled the chat from last time and I had it up, but now I'm not sure where it went. Hold on. To see what questions are still left in the chat, Andrew, but did you want to like give a brief overview of kind of like what you guys talked about last time, or like where you left things off? Or a brief recap, I guess, maybe is better.
Sure, maybe it'll prompt the questions again, because we all forget from day to day, at least I do.
Yeah.
From this really simplified sort of version of where we're at is, according to the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness, they're estimating we are about 3,000 apartments, homes, housing units short of the need for the homeless population in the county. And that's broadly defined as folks who are in the shelters, unsheltered, in and out, combination, all those things, which is a fairly large number, but is not nearly what we're seeing in other major cities in the Western US, at least. Within that, in Salt Lake City proper, we are seeing probably about 300, give or take, individuals who are unsheltered and camping who do not have another location to be at any one point in time. And there are probably more of them than that on the streets now, but there's a portion of them that either have a place to be or are using that in the daytime sort of business sense. So based on our HIMSS numbers from the last couple of years, our winter overflow this winter, and any data we've got, that's our best guess. So 300 for the unsheltered population is actually pretty manageable if we jump on it now. And so the big thrust from the mayor's office, from the coalition, is to get options, indoor options in place as soon as possible. If it was this week, great. Next week, next month, definitely before the winter time, because we do have that winter overflow need year in, year out. If we can make this overflow an option all year, it's more consistent and we don't have these fluctuations in the unsheltered population in and out. It's easier on everybody in those cases. Providers who really don't enjoy ramping up and shutting down those winter options. It's painful, it's emotional on everybody to do that. For those who are staying there and have to leave, it's hard. It's just bad all around. So the other thing we've looked at is a bunch of other sort of temporary options, sanctioned campgrounds, those kind of things. Really, those would be seasonal. And even then it's difficult because of particularly this year is a good example of extreme drought and heat in the summertime and potentially below zero temperatures in the wintertime. So it makes it hard to have a year-round outdoor sort of option. And it requires about as much money to ensure safety, security, hygiene, all those services as it would to be indoors and have that consistently. So the coalition has recommended for a couple of years now to push for an indoor option rather than, I'll maybe use the term settle. I hate to say that, but settle for an outdoor option, like a lot of cities have, who have not been able to even wrap their head around the actual numbers of unsheltered individuals in their cities. So that's a short sort of what we're looking at, and also gives you a sense of what we're doing. So a small group of folks in the coalition, myself included, are working on acquiring motels or hotels in Salt Lake City, outside of Salt Lake City. We need a mixture across the valley, potentially. At least 300 beds right now. Those are really preferable at this time. COVID was a good example of congregate settings. Big open spaces of beds have been cost effective in the past, but are difficult to manage. We've always had problems managing like flu outbreaks in the wintertime in those settings. COVID showed that having the rooms was also more preferable for individuals who are unsheltered to come in. So we're looking at those motels for that reason. It's also beneficial in the sense that the federal stimulus money we're looking at now which we have 2 to 4 years to spend. I think 2 years to allocate, and then 4 years to actually do the expenditures. That is being offered to use for acquisition of non-congregate settings, and motels would fit that. So we can use federal stimulus dollars, and those can be transitioned to housing either immediately or later on, depending on how the system needs. We know that just building more shelter beds doesn't solve the issue. We need housing. So having that flexible option is really preferable for the system right now. So that's a lot of what we're doing immediately. The other piece that we're looking at right now for Salt Lake City itself is a way to prioritize camp abatements and cleanings. There are significant health issues in camps, particularly larger camps, which is why the health department has done cleanings in there, we call them abatements, as camps get too large or unwieldy. It's been limited partly by health department staff bandwidth and resources, and Salt Lake City Police Department resources and the ability to do that. We've probably been able to do one every week or every other week based on getting those two matched up. We need that more frequently, so we're working on a new agreement with the health department, and having more police officers in the pipeline could help with that as well. But the prioritization would essentially prioritize certain places in the city that are probably more vulnerable to impacts. What we've seen is that large encampments out in front of the resource centers, the Youth Resource Center, the Wiegand Center downtown, have caused problems in people getting into services there, and miscommunication about if there's beds open. We've had people who have come up and looked and said there must be no beds because there's so many people out front, when there are beds some days. So that's been a high priority. Senior centers, schools, especially as you get back into post-summer. It would help everybody understand how we're enforcing the prioritizing enforcement of the no camping ordinance, and give some ground rules and barriers there while we work on that 300 beds. So those are both things that we're working on internally. There's legal issues involved in that. There's police bandwidth issues involved in that. There's county health department. There's other stakeholders to ensure everyone's got bought into this. So that's all happening right now at the same time. The last thing that might be a part of this discussion is about car camping and RV camping. It's one of the issues that hasn't been discussed as much as the other pieces, but it's significant. We've probably a really rough estimate, and you'll know what I mean by rough when I say 50 to 100 vehicles. It's been hard for us to track and monitor how many exactly we have at any point in time in the city camping on streets or in vacant lots. The parking ordinance is on one block face. You can be there for 48 hours, and then you have to move to a new block face minimum. It's generally done on a complaint basis. If a vehicle is occupied by somebody who's living there, our mechanism for towing, like the consequence of towing a vehicle, is difficult. For the obvious reason that towing with somebody in the vehicle is hard. When the vehicle goes into impound, you can't have somebody in the vehicle and impound and lock them up in there. And if the vehicle goes to impound, the yard and the tow relies on somebody paying to get the vehicle out to pay for the costs of all that. And oftentimes people aren't getting them out. If they're inoperable, then they have to break them down, deconstruct them literally to get them to the dump. And that can cost anywhere from $750 to almost, I want to say it was like $1,500, somewhere in there per vehicle. And that's all costs that tow yard doesn't recoup. They just lose the money by the contract with us. So they're hesitant to actually do that. So this is a hard sort of thing that we are working on to figure out how do we get vehicles operable to make them able to move and enforce the ordinance more effectively. And how do we get a different outreach for those vehicles? Because generally the folks in the vehicles don't see themselves as homeless like the folks who are in the tents would be. It's oftentimes hard to get a hold of them during the daytime. Sometimes they're working, sometimes they're out, and they don't engage in services. The outreach team to go and meet with them have consistently reported across the board they don't engage. They don't want services. They see themselves as temporarily there, and they're going to move on at some point, even if the vehicle is broken down and eventually we have to get rid of it. So we're still working on a better way to outreach to them. My hope is that with the motel concept, we can sort of wrap them into that as well. This is also an issue for West Valley, particularly in some other cities. And so we see it as a county-wide issue, and we'd like to see the county be a part of that discussion for car camping and RVs, because I think that's not going to get smaller. If you've seen Nomadland or read the book, you get a sense of sort of the larger landscape of car camping in the US. Some of it's very itinerant and following jobs, but as it grows, more and more of it are sort of being stuck in certain locales. And we've seen that here as well. So maybe that's a starting point for everybody, if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Andrew. There was a question in the chat, and so I'll just read it. When you do the cleanups with the health department and the police, do you give the individuals notice and allow them to gather and remove their belongings?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. One is the health department does have to post any sort of cleanup for 48 hours in advance, I believe. That's a legal thing that they do. But from the city end, we have had the VOA outreach teams generally go in the week before, at least once or multiple times, to engage all the individuals. They know it's coming, help them as much as we possibly can, to get the resources, number one, and also just to know in advance of what's coming on what days. We do have some room in a place for your things. The storage option we've had for a number of years on 5th West, that's free for the unsheltered to put their belongings in if they don't want to carry everything everywhere. So we try and engage them to get their stuff into there if they need to move. We try and get them into housing other resources. There are literal resource fairs in some of these abatements beforehand, where a couple of days, all the providers will be on site for multiple hours to do everything we possibly can to get them in, including Advantage Services, which does a lot of cleanings across the city, and the downtown ambassadors kind of draw from that crowd as well. We'll hire the unsheltered homeless for those jobs. So we'll do that option in those fairs as well. So a lot of outreach is done beforehand.
Thank you. And can you give us an update about the tiny home project?
Sure. The tiny home project was something that Mayor Mendenhall really likes, the concept of, particularly based on a model out of Austin, Texas, where a nonprofit has gotten some land outside of the city limits, and with a lot of private money, built a tiny home community, which is it's got to be at least 50 acres for phase one kind of thing, maybe 40s, and then multiple phases after that, and a variety of types of homes. But the key concept is small homes, shared amenities like cooking places, bathrooms, showers. So the cost comes way down. But they also build a little economy in there where they can have mutually effective jobs with each other for folks in the community. They have a store where they sell their goods. They've worked on public transit to hook them into the public transit system in Austin, all that sort of thing. Locally, a nonprofit was established. Camille Winnie, who formerly with the Downtown Alliance, is now working for the Other Side Village, it's called. It's sort of an offshoot of the Other Side Academy, which has had some services on 7th East for a couple of years now. And so they're, as a nonprofit, they're actually moving this discussion along themselves outside the city. What the city's done is to talk to them about land and see if we can help with that piece, and then help out with the zoning and collaboration with other private funders to figure out how do you finance this kind of a model, make it work. So the city hasn't put money directly into this as much as in-kind time from some staff to do a lot of groundwork on a couple of pieces of property in the city. A lot of work done on zoning issues because this is unique. We haven't seen this type of a development before. And there's a lot of specific things involved in that the city needs to look at, make it work. It's in the city's best interest in some ways, because if we can make this concept work, it could have pretty big implications on a lot of other zoning in the city and types of housing we could have. That might be slightly more traditional, but missing middle stuff. So I think it's a mutually beneficial project for the city. Right now, that group is looking at a particular piece of land near I-215, that area, that's city owned. There's some complications in it, some environmental contamination issues historically there. There's a utility line, I think, directly through the middle of the property that has like a 60-foot buffer on either side of it. There's a variety of things they're working through right now. So the nonprofit is leading that, paying for environmental sort of review, and the city is working on the zoning implications of that. So That's as far as they've gotten currently. I don't have a time frame for them thinking about breaking ground or finishing yet. So I'd have to get some more updates from them. But last I heard, I would be surprised if it's this year, but that's just my guess.
Okay, thank you. There are some questions from last time. I'm not sure if they got answered. One was, is there discussion about the impact of the new prison having fewer beds and criminal justice reform not being implemented?
On the Salt Lake Valley Coalition level, there's a subgroup, public safety and legal rights, that I'm a part of, and that has been a part of their discussions going forward. They take a broad view of this, though, that Matt Dumont, who's the head of the county jail, is a co-chair with myself on that. And then we bring in all sorts of issues from the safety and the actual facilities in the city, the homeless resource facilities, but also the broader stuff. There's clearly a connection between the two, as far as folks who are in prison oftentimes end up homeless in some capacity at some period of time in that process. We don't quite know yet what the impacts are going to be. We know what the impacts have been so far on justice reform. I think the report that came out from the state was that while justice reform may be a good idea for equity, equality issues, and fairness for a lot of things in sentencing and guidelines and all that resources, what didn't happen was when they changed the statutes of sentencing and they made it, what's a good term, easier to transition from incarceration to non-incarceration settings. What they were relying on is funding the non-incarceration settings, probation officers, parole officers, behavioral health services for substance use and mental health issues, all those kind of things. They needed to bulk up that. So when you transitioned out or didn't go here and got diverted to that system, there are resources. They didn't do that. The audit said very clearly there, if you're going to decrease the number of beds to do more outpatient services, which is a good idea, you got to pay for the services, and they haven't done that in the state level. So we have seen a lot of folks who were supposed to go instead of jail into services, not get into services and end up back in our system. So that is a discussion within the coalition. I think a lot of folks need to raise that again at the state level. They have done a couple of things on a smaller scale. One is they funded a receiving center concept in multiple counties, and ours is set to open up in a couple of years here down at 33rd South, Oxbow area. And that's a no barrier place for police to bring anybody into. And from there, they can figure out what's going on. If they need to be incarcerated, okay. But if this is a substance use issue, a mental health issue, something they need to go into treatment services immediately, don't go into jail, go into treatment services immediately, residential or otherwise. That's a couple of years off, though. That's a good step. I haven't heard anything specific about what the state's plans are to bulk up their treatment services options for folks who are going to be diverted from prison or away from prison into those. But that's certainly an issue on the top of a lot of our minds. Unfortunately, we haven't had a lot of discussion with them about that. And a lot of the focus has been on the housing piece, at least in the last couple of months.
Gotcha, thank you. And there was one last question I think that didn't get answered from last time. Is there any published data on the effectiveness of Housing First in Utah? And I'm reading this from somebody else. So I'm in some of the conversations with people who are pushing back against Housing First, and I'd love to have access to evidence that fiscally supports those ideas.
I'd have to look and see about Utah specific data. I can say anecdotally, 15 years ago, when the state led the push with Lloyd Pendleton to build Housing First projects for the chronically homeless, that ended up with the building of Sunrise Metro in Salt Lake City, an apartment complex, permanent supportive housing, Grace Mary Manor, which is down in Midvale, and then Palmer Court, those three. And that was several hundred units that came online. And that had a dramatic and immediate impact on the chronically homeless population in the state. So we had a big decrease because a lot of folks got housed with services on site. And we did see a decrease in the census in the road home at that point. And so it worked really well anecdotally from seeing the effects of that. And that's where that whole narrative of Utah's ended homelessness, so to speak, came from, because that particular phase of the efforts happened, but then the second and third phases never happened. It sort of stopped at that point. And so it was sort of a preemptive sort of success, not following through with the other steps that needed to keep it going. Now, as far as data goes, the National Alliance to End Homelessness has a great website and a particular link where they do a meta-analysis of all of the literature on housing first and break it down to effectiveness, both in the US and internationally. And so I can look that up and find it and post it if you want, and that might be the easiest way to start that process. Every year, the state also releases their report on homelessness through Housing Community Development at Department of Workforce Services at the state level. And that's a public document that you can just Google and find. And they generally have all the data from the state. It's not necessarily related to housing first necessarily, but it is all the homeless data for the state.
Yeah, the report that you were talking about that you could post, if you could send it to me, I can get it to the person that was asking specifically about that. So
I definitely can do that. And if I have any downtime, I'll post it here too if I can find it quick, but we'll get it to the other.
Okay, perfect. The other question that I had was, how can community members or community council like leaders help in this work that you are doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Gets asked a lot. It's frustrating sometimes to feel powerless in this and see this overwhelming sense of how do we handle this? I can't even bite off a piece of it. And so some groups have gone out themselves, Nomad Alliance and a couple other activist groups, and tried to provide food and clothing and services right on site in a really low barrier way, kind of grassroots kind of method. That can be helpful. Sometimes, depending on how it's done, it can be hurtful. It's a mixture of things there. So I don't necessarily tell folks not to do things like that, but I would say that do your research on the group you're going to work with. And also, I would try and coordinate with other groups and the coalition. I say that because for years and years during the holidays, generally Thanksgiving to Christmas, we would have a ton of groups coming downtown and just setting up shop in the back of their vehicle and giving out food or clothing or random things for the holidays. And it's a really feel-good moment for them. What would happen though is that for weeks we would have just literally tons of stuff left in Pioneer Park and other places because everybody wanted to give at the same time. And there wasn't a possible way that the unsheltered homeless could use all that stuff. It would end up just clogging up the streets, the sidewalks, the gutters, et cetera. So, and Pamela Atkinson would say, talk to me. She would say, call me up. Here's my number. Let's coordinate a little bit so we can get some consistency here, make it more effective for everybody, yourself included, so people feel good about doing it and that. So I'd say coordinate if you're going to do that. On the advocacy piece, we have the numbers now in the county about what the housing needs are for those who are homeless. That's below median income housing. For those of you who know the lingo, it's below 40% median income, which is the population we're talking about. We need about 3,000 units in the county this year and probably 1,400 every year after that. Within that 3,000, we need probably about 10% or maybe a little more than that for permanent supportive housing. That is housing that has case management on site, sometimes medical services on site, has a support staff there to work with folks who are living there. That is particularly good for folks with severe mental illness who maybe have medication but need help to sort of manage that consistently, who have some addiction issues, or who have some health issues like age-related things, because we have a large population of folks who are over the age of 60. That kind of housing is incredibly helpful for us, but it's not, nobody will build it because it doesn't pencil. It doesn't make sense to make money off of this. You don't. And so we need to advocate with the county, the state, anybody we can for that particular housing, permanent supportive housing. And I can post this. I think from the city, we've been talking about trying to get a very short thing out about how to advocate for particular things with the state. If we could get that housing, and that's going to take money, public money, and probably some private money, we can build, 300 of those units as well, which is a reasonable number. That's a couple of developments, really. It's two, maybe three most, but probably two developments. we could get a much quicker flow out of the resource centers because there's a group of folks living in the resource centers permanently. They're generally a little older, have some barriers like mental illness or some addiction issues, and they don't leave. 60% of the folks coming to the resource centers are there for one stay or maybe 2 short stays, and they leave and we never see them again. That's the population we think about when we think about mentoring and jobs and sort of just a quick get back on your feet concept. They do that, and that's effective. But there's this population that call the resource center home permanently, and they've been there almost every day for the last 2 years in these facilities because there's literally no place for them to go and move that'll work for their functioning ability. If we got them moved out, we'd have much more bed space on a nightly basis and more flow through there. They'd get better services, frankly, than they do right now, despite the best efforts of the providers. So let me get something from the city out to folks about permanent supportive housing advocacy. But then generally speaking, it's about housing. And I know that's a tricky concept depending on the neighborhood you're in the city. Having served on the Poplar Grove Community Council and the City Council, I get that piece. I will say, I think there are ways to make it work equitably across the city in the right places in the right ways. And so I would look at housing as a fundamental piece. The city can't build all 3,000 units, and we won't. But we're going to carve out what we think we can take responsibility for as a member of our broader community, and then expect other cities, the county, the state to manage more of that stuff. But that means in the city, we're going to have to talk a lot about where certain housing goes, sizing of housing, types of housing. Those are incredibly important conversations, because if we can take somebody from the street corner in front of your park, get them into housing, it benefits everybody in the city. So I'd say advocating hard for those things is critical.
Sorry, I was just reading over the chat from last time to make sure I'm not missing any questions that people wanted to ask, but I think we got them all. And I love the piece about the advocacy. And if there is some sort of like write-up or something that you have that we can send out to folks, because I will send this recording along with any links that you have to information to the group, because this is sort of a normal for us to have this type of turnout. So definitely want to make sure that the information is sent out to everybody who wasn't able to attend today. So yeah.
That's right. I know I recognize Ellen and Jordan and Jamie and Dennis, and that's who we really need.
Yeah.
Reach into the choir, baby.
Well, Ellen, since you are from community council, like leadership, are there any questions that you have specifically that we didn't answer today?
Not really. I just find that I have to educate the people in my community to not be so offended that someone is living in the hills and not invade their space. We've had some problems with people invading homeless people's spaces and rearranging or deciding what they should have and what they shouldn't have. And Dennis has helped us a lot with that.
Yeah, we all know Greg.
Getting people to understand, to respect everyone, no matter what level of challenges they have.
Yeah, I think something that may be slightly more unique to this year than past years is we've always had fire danger up there, but this year is particularly acute. We are in the prioritization discussion right now. That's a high priority. It also puts more pressure though, because generally folks, there's different populations in the unsheltered community. There's folks that hide, essentially. They don't like bright colors. They don't like to be seen very often. They go to the river and they go to the foothills, right? It's private. If there's mental health issues, they feel more comfortable sometimes away from other folks, all those kind of reasons. But with the fire danger and the environmental impacts, it's been particularly hard this year to say it's okay. And so I think as those get abated, potentially, we may see more pressure in town. And that's that funky trade-off that's hard to talk about. That's why the abatement is a temporary sort of way to manage the health concerns, and prioritization is a temporary way to manage this. But we need to have those 300 beds immediately to get folks off the street in. Otherwise, we're gonna have this push and pull continually across the city about where people go, which we've had in the past, as you all are aware.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, I think we're sort of at the end of our time, unless there's any other burning concerns or questions or anything that we need to cover. But yeah, Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to just kind of follow up on some of those last questions that didn't get answered last time because we got cut off there. But as always, you know, if there are things that you think SLCN can help with, or that we can bring to the community councils to have like a larger discussion about as you guys are like getting these plans together and working through all of these things, definitely don't hesitate to reach out to us so that way we can get you guys on the schedule and like we can get the conversation flowing again. And I'm sure this will not be the last time that we have homelessness as a topic of discussion. So you'll probably hear from us again at some point. But
my goal is to take it off the conversations permanently, but we'll see how quickly we can do that.
yeah.
Solving it.
I'm sure there'll be things that pop up, so no worries. But with that said, I guess we will give you back about what, like 20 minutes-ish of your day. So hopefully everyone can use it productively, or just grab another cup of coffee before you get into your next meeting. But with that, thanks everybody for coming, and then we'll send something out to everyone who wasn't able to be here.
Thanks, Andrew.
Hey, thanks everybody. Thanks, Jasmine.
Take care.
See you guys.
You as well.